Hey guys, how's it going? Jay Sensational here. Welcome back to the channel. It's been a while. Might have been this is the first video of the year. Starting the year off strong here in February, but it's been taking a little bit of break. A little bit unexpected, but the meta itself was a little bit tiring for me, and I couldn't really find much creativity until this balance patch. And so we're back here. Today is gonna be Tuesday for you guys, so this is going to be dropping out the next day, which is tomorrow on Wednesday, the 8th of February, something like that. And this is pretty exciting. This is one of the bigger patches. If you guys remember way back when Swain actually received, or that, you know, when Swain was a 5 attack overwhelm unit leveled up, this is the same level of patch, I would say, in the terms of how many cards got affected. So super excited once this drops, and I think there's some really cool things that we'll cover in this video. But first things first, the webcam is currently down. I'm getting a new webcam by the end of the week, so you're stuck with the Three Stooges for now. But yeah, let's jump into it, shall we? So first things first, we have a few cards surrounding Alawi. Alawi is getting a small buff with one card, mainly Tentacle Smash with the Nagaboros, and it's a little bit on the side, but Alawi going from a 1/6 to a 2/6, and Tentacle Smash going from 4 mana to 3 mana. Now, Alawi itself, I think it's a little bit less of a needed change, I guess. They are changing Quietus, which we'll cover in a few slides, but having the extra attack so that Alawi can block a little bit better is always nice. Although I think that it's I don't know, we'll see. Tentacle Smash, on the other hand, is I think one of the bigger changes. Now, of course, not only is Tentacle Smash going down to 3 mana, it's also important to note that Alawi herself, her champion spell, is also Tentacle Smash, so a little bit of a double dip there. Now, Tentacle Smash used to be a 4 mana spawn 3, now they turned to a 4 mana spawn 2, which was pretty much unplayable, and now it's coming down to a 3 mana spawn 2 with the strike, right? And I feel like that has to be quite good. One of the reasons why it's good is, well, now it's 3 mana, right? So you can play it with only your spell mana. If you bank 3 spell mana, you can play the card, right? And 3 mana for a spawn 2 and a strike, that's pretty good, honestly. I think it's like, it probably doesn't rival the 4 mana spawn 3 just because the stats obviously matter a little bit more, but having the extra flexibility and the utility of it, especially because it's champion spell, right? Now, I do think that Alawi is honestly quite, as much as it doesn't show based off of stats and things like that, just, you know, because Alawi hasn't really been playable since Bard Alawi days. I think Alawi is still quite strong as an archetype, especially with the release of Hand of God, the weapon that they got, the 2 mana weapon. That is just spawn 2. I think it's a very snowball-y kind of mid-range deck, and I feel like this 3 mana Tentacle Smash, along with this slight buff to Alawi, can actually be quite powerful. And depending on how this patch shapes up, as we see a few other of the mid-range decks kind of shifting around, Alawi could be potentially a very powerful deck, and I think it honestly already has some signs. I've been seeing some play of Alawi Ione deck that is quite powerful if you can't really interact with it. Now, Nagaboros gets a little bit of a weirder change. Her effect now is also on a summon as well as round start, so if you do have this 12 power tentacle, you do get to do some cool things with it. Of course, I think this is just a little bit too late game. If you already have a 12+ power tentacle on turn 8, you're probably already winning the game, or you probably already won before you get to this point. It is a lot better. This is much more of a quality of life change for really what is Alawi role players trying to get to this sort of late game condition. But I do feel like this Alawi change is quite impactful, in line with some of the other changes that we are going to be seeing. Now, for the next set of changes, we have just a few more miscellaneous changes, and this is what I think is more towards addressing the Alawi buff, and here we have a Kayn as well as a Aatrox nerf in a sense. I'll cover these two first and then I'll come back to these two. But their origins are receiving a little bit of a change. Kayn and Aatrox themselves are unchanged, but Kayn now has to, you have to play 4 cultist units before you get to draw Kayn, and Aatrox is now 3 different Darkens. And this has been confirmed that if you play a weapon and the Darken off of it, it counts as the same Darken. So having to play 3 different Darkens means you have to like pretty much equip 3 different weapons in order to draw the Aatrox. And now I think these are actually quite impactful changes, especially to Aatrox. Kayn, you know, if you draw an early curve 3 to 4, you can still get it out by the turn you want, especially because the Dark Thrall that you get off the Bloodletters counts as a cultist for his Kayn. So if you get something early like that, you're usually pretty fine. Now Aatrox, on the other hand, is a slightly different story. A lot of times when you're playing Aatrox deck, you know, equipping 2 weapons like the Harp plus Spear, or maybe like Bloodletters plus Spear, whatever it may be, is generally pretty easy, right? But having to play 3 different Darkens, I guess Kayn counts as a Darken itself, you will have times where it's a little bit slower to tutor out the Aatrox from the origin effect, which I do think can be quite impactful if you don't draw Aatrox, right? This deck does rely pretty heavily on Aatrox as a sort of pressure engine, things like that, just because as regen and drawing a second gives you access to the strike spells. So this is going to be probably the bigger impact. Maybe Kayn might even be bigger impact because it's more important to, you know, draw Kayn on 5 in order to play it and then have that count towards Aatrox, right? So because of the Aatrox change as well, or because of the Kayn change rather, I think the Aatrox change also gets a little bit more of a sort of quote unquote nerf to it. Now, a lot of decks have already been going back to 2 Aatrox because, well, it was too easy to draw him, and having all 3 is a little bit bricky. So now decks might just go back to 3 Aatrox, right? Because they need that consistency. So if you don't actually get to trigger this draw effect before turn 6, well, maybe you can naturally draw into one of your Aatroxes or predict into them with 3 copies in your deck. Now, Super Mega Death Rocket is going from 4 damage to 3 damage. This is a nice change just to keep Jinx in check, as Jinx has kind of skyrocketed up the ladder now that she creates a Super Mega Death Rocket on level up. So definitely a very nice change in my opinion. Definitely gives decks that are a little bit slower, a little bit more breathing room, and still has the ability to just deal 1 tall enemies, which is one of the, you know, the pressure points, right? Imagine like a Pirates having that TF red card every turn. Having the ability to slow it down a little bit and just take away a little bit of that reach potential is quite good. It's still going to be very, very powerful as a Jinx deck. You just maybe need an extra turn or an extra bit of burn to kind of finish the game. Last change over here is Katarina going from a 3-2 to a 2-2 on level 1, and of course on level 2 going to a 3-3. So that's the only change to Katarina. They're taking away 1 power, and I realistically think that this is a sort of non-change. It's sort of like when Poppy went from a 4-3 to a 3-3, but even Poppy had to, like, you know, the Poppy needed to other units to have that level of attack, right? And that change was pretty irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. And in the similar vein, I do think this Katarina change does kind of fall into the same bucket. She's not any easier to kill. She doesn't have any less value when she levels up and you replay her, things like that. If you're playing in a hollow deck, the attack doesn't really matter all that much. The high level synergy points of Katarina decks, such as the hollow, like the Hollow Dancers or Hillock or the Foyer, are still all present, right? Now, I don't want to say this change means absolutely nothing because, well, a critical point of this is having 2 attack and meaning that Katarina needs a strike, is that other cards, like if you want to consider Troll Chant or Scrying Sands, they have that extra added bonus in being able to stop Katarina's attack for a turn, which could mean the difference between leveling Katarina or getting off her effect, or, you know, kind of just getting to that point where you feel comfortable having that level of Katarina in hand. So there aren't no conditions where this change doesn't do anything differently, but for the vast majority of the part, I think this change is quite tame, and I don't think really addresses why Katarina is powerful right now. Especially because, spoiler, in this patch we also don't see any changes to the overall hollowed archetype that Katarina is present in as the most powerful Katarina deck. So Katarina, I don't think really got much of a change. Jinx decks, not really that much. You know, Echo Jinx doesn't really care too much about this. Even like Jinx Lulu, a lot of the pressure comes on the board state, and they usually have enough burn in the matchups they need it. But some niche cases where they'll be off by 1 or 2 damage, you know, they'll come back and bite. It's changed, right? Kayn Aatrox change, I think, is the obvious culprit, or culprit's a weird word, but the obvious sort of showcase of the most heavily impacted out of this patch. Slowing down Kayn also inherently slow down Aatrox, so if you don't draw Kayn on 5, that's 1 less darken for your Aatrox level up. And I could see this deck being slowed down even a little bit further after Aatrox already had his nerf earlier this season. So I'm going to be very interested to see where Kayn Aatrox lands, and we might even see Alawi or some of the other decks kind of pop out as the star mid-range decks going in this patch. A few more, and probably what I think is the most impactful change of this patch, we have Quietus finally. So Quietus now, instead of kills any unit with 2 or less power, now kills any unit with 4 total power and health. So a 0-4, a 1-3, a 2-2, a 3-1, or a 4-0, which doesn't exist, right? So now this is capped, right? It doesn't kill any unit with, you know, less than 2 power or 2 or less power, but a very sort of capped, conditional sort of target that it can go after. Now it still has the ability to destroy units' equipment, which was maybe half the reason why Quietus was being run, but it does lose a little bit of that flexibility in being able to kind of soft target most early units or low attack champions in the game. Veigar, Braum, Alawi, things like that, right? And that used to kind of fold to Quietus. You can no longer Quietus things like Victor, you can't Quietus Kayn, right? These are kind of the sort of scarier 4-drop champions that kind of folded to Quietus in the past that might see a little bit more breathing room now that Quietus has its nerf, right? It's not to say Quietus is now a dead card, not really. It still kills most 1-drops except for a 3-2 Legion Rearguard. And it still has a decent time against some of the 2-drops, at least the engine ones that I think would apply a lot more pressure and you'd feel more obligated to kill them. Those being like the Duran Sculptor, like the 2-2s, right? For example. So I think this Quietus change is quite impactful, quite needed, as I do think some champions were kind of folded away a little bit, or it definitely gets a lot harder, trickier, and feels worse to have to play into Quietus as some of the listed champions. I have Nakaboros going from a burst card to a focus card. One thing that they did mention is just sort of the thing that where they don't want to limit what kind of burst blockers you have. And if you're being aggressive with this card, or I say you're a plunder card attacking, open attacking with Eye of Nakaboros, any open attack deck still has this capability, right, of being able to spawn 2 at burst and kind of just getting in for a nice open attack. Now, what this impact, I think what is kind of less obvious about this change is the fact that not only is the spawn 2 locked behind the focus speed, the draw 2 is also locked behind the focus speed as well. So if you're a slower deck, say you're a TF, like Conservatory, like Annie TF, right? Or Katarina TF. Or you're like a Nami deck. Or you're like whatever, right? Some slower, more control-y or mid-range deck can no longer use this card to draw at burst, right? So if you're playing against an aggressive opponent and they're having attack and you need to draw for or look through your deck for answers, this is no longer an option open available for you, right? So this is kind of twofold into a lot of the slower decks that kind of wanted this card to not only have that ability to burst block, but also kind of cycle through your deck to look for answers, is losing something very, very critical. So while for some decks this might not have much of an impact at all, for other decks this is a huge change that is hard to find a replacement for. You might have to go back to salvage if you're going for some of these slower mid-range decks that need that ability to kind of just cycle through your deck at burst in order to like look for answers or things like that. So this could be a very big change that limits the kind of decks that are able to run this card, which is one of the things that the devs wanted to do. They didn't want this card to be universal, right? They want to focus a little bit more on that aggressive ability like Pirates, Plunder, Alawi decks, having that open attack availability, but not so much as the block as well as the draw. Now for me, I personally, I'm always slightly more towards the slower game plan. It's going to be tough to see this go. Things like, I was gonna say Rise, but that's not a good example. Like imagine if like Drum Solo or Deep Med was like focus speed, right? That's the kind of impact that I feel looking at this card. So quite an impactful change to this card. And then lastly on this one, we have Poro Cannon going from 0 mana to 1 mana. I think one of the things that really shows, or some of these changes show about Patch as well as the devs, is I do think that they're thinking and looking very critically at potential problem cards, right? And I'm very happy that they have identified Poro Cannon as potentially one of these cards. Now you might think, Poro Cannon, why is this a problem, right? Why should it cost 1 mana? And to me, it's this discard 1, right? For a very long period of time, discard, you could even call it a downside, right? A drawback. But as the game progresses and we've had much more synergistic cards, being able to discard a card is most likely, for any deck that actually runs discard cards, an advantage, right? It's something that the deck wants to be doing and is something that enables their deck in a sense, right? Like imagine Jinx Lulu being able to Poro Cannon out Flame Chompers with Lulu on turn 3 for 3 mana. Now you can't do that anymore. You can't curve 1 mana. You can't curve like a Beard into Boom Baboon into Lulu Poro Cannon, for example, right? You have to pay that 1 mana. You have to play Poro Cannon. You have to play like the other 1 mana card that discards a card and manifests a Machiordal. And that could impact certain decks, right? This definitely slows down even discard aggro, being able to empty out your hand with Jinx to get the rocket, right? Whatever it may be, being able to have a 0 mana discard card was a huge crutch. And yeah, you get some Poros sometimes, right? Sometimes Poro matters, you know, being able to curve out. Now you can't go like Poro Cannon on turn 1 into Poro, right? So it's no longer a 1-drop Poro in hand either. So it's a huge change, and I think this card was one of those enabler cards that was kind of flying under the radar for quite a long time. So I think this shows good foresight from the devs, and being able to identify cards that I think are quite strong and, you know, might see a little bit more variety in terms of kind of what comes into this space. And for this part, we have a few more buffs. This patch has nerfs, but it also does have quite a few buffs that I think are quite cool. These ones are probably a little bit less cool than some of the other ones that I'm pretty excited to get into, but overall they're trying to look a little bit more into Ornn. Apprentice going from a 1/1 to a 1/2, Artisan going from a 1/4 to a 2/3, and Mender going from a 5/5 to a 4/5, but foraging twice, are all looking towards this Ornn kind of forge mechanic that they want to improve. Now, I think that the best Forge card, if you're really kind of diving into this archetype, is of course Ornn's Forge, the landmark. And these cards don't really come close to the level of like power level that provides in terms of Forge. And this Forge archetype is always just kind of held back by the ability for most regions to have access to ways of destroying weapons, Quietus, Silence and Suppress, heavy metal, things like that. Even like, you know, Unworthy Soul, that completely just nullify what Ornn is trying to do. And that's always sort of been the problem for Ornn, rather than, you know, these cards being weak, albeit, you know, these cards were weak, right? Now, Ornn himself is going to a 5-5 instead of a 4-4, and the devs were looking to make him slightly easier to level up. This change is a little bit weird, awkward, because if Ornn is coming down level, well, you're probably going to lose the game realistically. So having extra stats doesn't really look all that appealing to me. And it's definitely on the lower end of impact, where I think that some of the other buffs that we're going to see have a lot higher level of impact. Which moves on to here. We have Maokai getting a small buff as well, going from a 1-4 to a 2-4. I think in a very similar vein of Alawi, where now that he has some blocking ability, albeit, you know, you probably still are very reluctant to block with Maokai because he does do pretty well as this sort of engine. Is this what's holding Maokai back? Obviously not. But any buff to underplay champions I think is always good. Jax, on the other hand, I think is getting a little bit more of a significant change. Jax on level 2 now just permanently has Overwhelm. Beforehand, it's his weapon that gets Overwhelmed, so Jax then has Overwhelm because he's equipping the Light of Acacia. But now he naturally has Overwhelm himself, which is a cool buff. It means that you can equip any weapon onto Jax because you're playing this like equip improvise kind of deck. You can pretty easily get the scout weapon, right? So getting scout weapon onto Jax is quite good now that he also base has Overwhelm. It also means that if the Light of Acacia is destroyed by any other means, Jax still has that Overwhelm to pressure your opponent, right? Because Jax does scale quite heavily if your opponent is not able to remove him, and he does grow pretty big, and the Overwhelm can be a lot of pressure. But I think the biggest part of this patch for Jax is these two cards to the right. And that's Fish Fight as well as Roar of Acacia, both becoming Weapon Master cards. For those of you unfamiliar, Weapon Master is the origin for Jax, and you can put any Weapon Master cards into a Jax deck. And now Fish Fight and Roar of Acacia join the collection of cards, so you don't have to be locked into Demacia to play these cards with Jax. And that's huge, right? Fish Fight is one of the best strike spells if you can trigger its ability, being a one-way strike. And you know, now that Jax has Overwhelm on its base level, and then the weapon very critically still has Overwhelm, and you say like Jax, Fish Fight, equip another, pop off the weapon, equip another ally with the Overwhelm, and kind of have extra threats, right? And Roar of Acacia also, what I would say to be a pretty good card, especially in a Jax deck where they have a sort of abundance of weapons to kind of utilize this card, where they have so many improvised cards, right? This can actually be honestly quite a lot of pressure if you get the quick attack weapon, for example, if you get the scout weapon, or even if you get like the attune weapon, just simply for the fact that it kind of refunds a little bit of a cost. And it obviously opens up Jax to a lot other sort of deck building, maybe like a Jax Kayn. In the past, you've seen like Jax Ornn. You might even see more aggressive variants of Jax decks, right? And I think that these all kind of feed into it now that these cards are no longer locked behind Demacia. So very, very cool to see Jax. And I think that Jax, in line with Alawi, we see these two kind of early game sort of mid-range style tempo decks, unit-based tempo decks, gaining these levels of advantage. Very, very interesting to see how these turn out, right? And it'd be cool if, you know, you equip, say like you make a big tentacle, you equip it, and then you like Fish Fight for 3, or you Fish Fight it, or like you tentacle smash and just like instant flip Jax. You have a lot of pressure there, right? And then Jax Alawi could be some potential, but Jax Kayn, you can still obviously play Jax Vayne or Jax Ornn, whatever it may be. Any Jax you do play is now a lot stronger, because two of the best cards that work well with weapons, especially with Jax and Improvise, are a lot better now as well. A few more here. We have Tristana gaining impact. Not that much of a change in my opinion. That's quick attack plus quick impact. Is that really what was holding her back? Not really. She has one extra impact going into her level up. Cool. Shard of Reverence. This is one of the world runes for Rise, going from a refill 2 mana to refilling all spell mana. So 3 essentially, right? And this, I think, is pushing it, and the devs know. I think Rise is a kind of archetype that you as in the collective you, and then also me personally, I would hate to see Rise. It brings me flashbacks of TLC, where it's this sort of late game oppressive kind of combo deck where, well, if you can't stop what they're doing, and it's quite difficult to stop what they're doing, you lose the game. And I don't want to say that, because I think there are a lot more interesting sort of late game engines and win cons that kind of get pushed out because of something like this. And this is probably the most impactful shard, or world rune rather, that you can change and buff. And this is probably the strongest outcome that could have happened. Maybe barring from like drawing 1 to drawing 2, but that's ridiculous. And now, of course, this doesn't change the fact that if you don't hit this rune as a Rise player, you're all the more sad, right? Because this is now super critical to your game plan. So there's still that element of chance, where now that it's all that much more critical to hit Shard of Reverence, right? Which I don't like. This shard, they made one world rune stand above everything else, and now they're making it even more, they're making it even taller, right? So I don't like this change in twofold. I don't want Rise to be strong, and I don't like that one shard or one world rune is even more powerful than the rest, because that just makes the variance of your games and whenever you either play or play against Rise so much worse. Shadow Shift. This is the Zed spell going from a 3 mana card to a 2 mana card. This one is interesting just because, you know, if you're playing Zed, Shadow Shift is likely, you know, your second Zed in hand, right? So it's like, well, do I use 3 mana to recall a unit? Maybe you're recalling Zed to replay Zed for 3 mana, or do I just play out a new Zed, right? Like, do I use 3 mana to save Zed, or do I just use 3 mana to replay Zed? And that cost was always a little bit weird. Most times you're just like, oh, okay, I don't want to play this card, and you just slam down your second Zed, right? Now you have a little bit more of an interesting sort of flexibility, right? Now that you're actually saving mana between saving Zed and replaying Zed, or, you know, utilizing in other cases where you do have a second Zed available, is, I think, a little bit more impactful. Now, will this card really see play? Not really. And if you use this card for protection, there's probably a lot better cards: Twin Discipline, Nopify, Memory Cloak, even Deny, things like that. They're just so much more impactful, even if they are costing less. You generate its card off of like Karma, College Silver may be cool, right? But overall, not a very impactful change, in line with your Sana change about the power level, and I don't really expect this to really bounce back in any sort of means. But if you're playing Zed, you have a little bit more of a treat if you draw 2. Now, Lissandra, I think, is probably the unexpected change of this path, where in addition to summoning a Frozen Thrall, she also advances it by 2. And this is obviously geared towards the Turbo Thrall's archetype as a whole. What I do think is actually quite cool about this change, and I think very in line with the deck, is that if you miss a Frozen Thrall on turn 1, or if you miss a Harbinger on turn 2, Lissandra comes down on turn 3, assuming you draw it, and it counts down by 2 to kind of catch you up, right? So I like this change because I think it's very heads up about what the deck wants to do. And I think it's a little bit more of a lifeline, right, than anything else. I still think that this doesn't really change how Frozen Thrall plays out. But if you are a fanatic of the deck and you miss out on the turns 1-2, but you have Lissandra, you have that ability to kind of catch up on what your deck wants to be doing, and you don't feel super far behind. Now, what could be interesting is now that, I guess it's still counted up 9, so it goes on countdown on 7. I was thinking that if you just play Lissandra on turn 3, on turn 10, you have a 8/8. If it was turn 9, then in some decks that might actually be okay, but unfortunately not. But again, I do think that this shows very good, I think, very good awareness from the devs in terms of how decks play out, throwing in a little bit more of a bone to a deck that, you know, and especially how it goes on curve with the countdown of 2 or advanced way 2, I think is super, super cool in terms of the play style of the deck. And I think it slots in quite nicely into it. All right, we got 5 more here, and I think these are some of the most impactful changes of the patch. Firstly, with Hate Spike. Hate Spike going from a 2-mana deal 2 to a 2-mana deal 3. And I do think this is a little bit of a nod to the Quietest nerf, where now you are losing out on that very, very powerful tempo play from the Shadow Isles deck. You're getting a little bit of a sort of bonus over here in Hate Spike. And I think this card is strong. 1 mana deal 2, strong. 2 mana deal 3, strong. 2 mana deal 2, not so much. And I think that this could be this is quite good. We talk about, I constantly harp about breakpoints, right? Between 2 and 3 mana. That's Jinx, that's Echo, that's Lulu, that's Jax leveled, I guess. You know, there's so many things that you want to deal 3 to. It just opens up your breakpoints so much. And Hate Spike was a super powerful card when it was a 1-mana deal 2. And I think as a 2-mana deal 3, you'll really be able to see that. Now, of course, it's not as oppressive early game compared to Quietest. It doesn't hit the same champions that Quietest used to do, like Veigar, Alawi, things like that. Whatever, Victor, you know, Kane, whatever it may be. It's still a very, very powerful tempo tool. And honestly, I'm happy to see it. I would much rather a card like Hate Spike than a card like Quietest. And I'm happy that they're giving some replacement to the level of tempo they can kind of generate off of this sort of self-sacrifice Shadow Isles archetype. Dragon Caller, 6 mana to 5 mana. This is a card you probably haven't seen, but this is a round start flow, summon an Ephemeral Empyrean, which is honestly really cool. So the earliest you're getting the Empyrean is turn 6. And I think it's like the Herald of Mag exchange, right? Herald of Mag used to be 6 mana, not 5, or no, it's the Safety Inspector. Safety Inspector vibes, right? Whereas Safety Inspector I think is actually a really cool change, and that's the 5 mana 5/5 from Banal City that works with landmarks. This one doesn't really have the same level of archetype impact that I think Safety Inspector did. And this card really wasn't experimented with or played much at all. Its effect is unsure, right? You have to flow for on turn 6 or turn 5 in order to get on turn 6, or you know, turn 6 to get on turn 7, whatever it may be. And you still have to invest the initial cost of playing it, right? So there is some chance that you can't activate flow on the turn you play it. Or that being in an Ionia, you have to play a little bit of a catch-up. You spend so much mana that you can't play Dragon Caller, right? So it's a little bit tricky. I don't know what kind of deck this would fall into. And I don't really see that being very, very strong or impactful. It's a cool change nonetheless. But the 2 exciting changes I want to cover. First one, Lucian. 2 mana 3/2 to a 1 mana 2/1. Crazy. It's insane. So Lucian going down to 1 mana means that obviously he can come down earlier. You can play a much more aggressive go wide strategy. You have 1 extra mana to spend in your early turns to really go wide to get that to that level up, right? Now Lucian being at 1 health is the obvious drawback, right? For the decks that wanted to deal with him, he's a lot easier to deal with, right? It didn't matter if you drop on turn 1 if he still gets Mystic Shot on turn 2, right? And now that he's down to 1 health, it's a lot harder to protect him. Even if you give him tough, still dice anything that deals 2, now opens up to a lot more things that ping him, now dies the Quietest. It's hard to say whether or not this is a buff or a nerf in terms of kind of, it's both, right? In the games where Lucian can't be dealt with, it's a straight up buff. He comes down earlier, he speeds up your deck's game plan. you get to level him up quicker and get to his like impact, right? For decks that could deal with him, this is a nerf because now he's more vulnerable to a lot more different things. And if you're running a champion slot, honestly, that just dies and doesn't really get that value. Because the reason why a lot of 1-mana champs are okay with it is because, well, they have a keyword that helps them connect with the Nexus. Quick attack does count, but they also have either a protection mechanic for themselves like Fizz, or some level of immediate impact like Zoe or Teemo. Lucian kind of doesn't have any of that, and he's still is very much so an all-in sort of champion for the most part. So this is simply a very, very polarizing change, where decks that couldn't deal with him now struggle even harder. Decks that could deal with him are better at doing so. So I'm skeptical, but I want to say that it's better. It's hard though. Albus Ferris. This is, I think, one of the most interesting changes. So this is the Jace tutor. He originally deals 1 damage to the enemy Nexus for every 6+ cost card or spell you've played. But now you deal 3 per spell. So if you've leveled Jace, you've cast 2, he deals 6. It's insane. You double cast a spell from Jace, he deals 12. The reason why this card wasn't being played is because he was slow, right? And didn't necessarily close out the game. How this is a finisher for the archetype. I think this is very strong. In this sort of, it's this Jace Heimer, it could be Jace Lux now, whatever that Jace deck is. Albus Ferris now, even if he is too slow, in cases where he's not too slow, he is this insane amount of pressure and burn that, Jace decks already had a decent amount with. You can double up Shock Blast for 6 damage, and now you compound 6 damage with Albus Ferris, right? Now all of a sudden Jace decks have access to a whole lot more burn should they run this card, or should their deck be allowed to, if the meta is slow enough, right? A very, very impactful change. I don't know, this one seems very good, so very interesting and excited to see what comes out of it. Last change, or second to last change, we have Weight of Judgment. This is going from a 4-mana deal 7 to a follower to a 3-mana deal 4 to a follower, and it's a 3-mana, and it still gets to deal 2 to a champion. I want to say this card's a nerf. 3-mana deal 4 in Shrima is, a dime in a dozen. Rather, that didn't make sense. It's inferior. You have Rite of Arcane, which is slow, same speed, deals 4 to a follower as well as a champion. And the only reason why Weight of Judgment was ever played was off of Shreeman Tellstones, in which case you had the extra flexibility. Play a 4-mana deal 7, which is a lot better than a 3-mana deal 4. And so I think that they kind of just shoved this card into even more oblivion. Now, being at 3 mana does mean that you can generate this card off the Lexicon Colleges or Trinket Trade, things like that. So there is going to be the level of flexibility if you're playing it with that sort of spell generation kind of deal. But if you're playing a card like Shreeman Tellstones, this is less likely to be picked unless you really need that deal 2, right, to a champion, in which case now you gotta save 1 extra mana. But overall, not super impactful, and I think a relatively small change. Never mind, there's more. Shyvana and Master Yi, both of them are getting changed in a very similar way. In the past, they had to have seen the damage being dealt. They had to see Dragon allies deal 12, and Master Yi had to deal 12 damage by himself, right? Now they can see them, they can level up in deck. So you see you have Dragon allies deal damage this game. It is going up from 12 to 16 as a little bit of a compensation. And Master Yi isn't changed at all, but the first you can die, and the second you can strike and potentially level up. Nothing else really has been changed about these cards, except for Shyvana getting a 2-mana Serving Strike instead of a 3-mana one, which is actually pretty important. But overall, I think Mastery, obviously straight buff. Shyvana, for the most part, I do think is a pretty nice quality of life buff. It does mean that if you're playing Shyvana on turn 4 or turn 3 as the first dragon, it's going to be a little bit slower to level her up. But if you draw her on like turn 7, for example, she's going to be leveled and have that immediate impact because now you're going to have the mana and bigger board to play that strafing strike, right? I think overall, quite nice buff for Shyvana. Mastery, straight up buff. Is that going to improve him? We'll see, but overall, just straight up buffs, quite nice with Shyvana. A lot of mid-range centric buffs here. We have Shyvana buff, we have Jax buff, we have a Lowy buff. It really looks like they want to herald in a new sort of base of mid-range within LOR, and it might be opening up for some of these. And oh boy, this one's kind of interesting. But Kayle getting a mana reduction from 6 to 5. She is going to a 1/5, but now she buffs herself, which in turn synergizes with herself and gets you a little bit closer to her level up, which hasn't changed. Now this is actually pretty good, right? Because not only are you getting the buff 1 turn earlier, but you're getting the level up 1 turn earlier, assuming you have that capability. Because Kayle is a round start level up, and when you used to play her on a 6, the earliest you can level her was on 7, and that was very, very slow. But now on 5 into 6, you know, you have an extra turn potentially, and that could be quite good. Is Kayle good? It's tough. It's really tough. You'd really have to see, but overall, like, these changes are good, right? Kayle, Shyvana, Jax, Ornn, Lowy, a lot of mid-range centric buffs across the board, and I'm very excited to see kind of what comes out of it. Very last, I believe we have 2 new cards, if I can find it somewhere. Aha, 2 new cards getting added to the game in with the balance patch. We have Soul Cleave, a 3 mana Shadow Owl's slow spell that says kill an ally to summon 2 ephemeral copies of it, and Castigate, 7 mana stream a slow card, kill all followers. Let's talk about Soul Cleave first. Soul Cleave is interesting in every sense of the word, because it's very, very powerful if you can, you know, hit exactly what you want off of it. And it's kind of limitless in sort of what potential it has, and that could be very good. Now the obvious downside is it's slow, it's interactable, and it might just be a bad card, but it's so sort of creative in how it can be used that I think there's always going to be some potential for this card. You can always take this card if it's generated in very niche scenarios, and maybe there's some ephemeral support for it, right? I always think that Soul Cleave, although it looks more like a meme tier card, there's going to be some potential for it in the future. Castigate, on the other hand, I think that's a straight up meme card. It's funny though. 7 mana kill all followers. Killing followers is always a little bit limited. Funnily enough, it does work on like all the Darkens, which could be pretty good. Not being able to kill champions. I guess not being able to kill like it doesn't if you only have champions and you play this card, but it's a little bit of a dream scenario setup, right? It could be strong, has potential, but it's a little bit too limited in what it does. And you know, when champions are sometimes the strongest things on your opponent's board, you don't want a dead 7 cost spell in your hand. But overall, patch plus new cards, I mean, I'm quite excited for his changes, and hopefully I'll be pumping out some more consistent content for you guys, especially once I get this face cam. It feels a little bit weird talking to you guys without face cam on, but that's covering all the changes. I'll link the patch notes when they come out. I just want to get this out because we did get a little bit of a sneak peek if you guys catch the stream yesterday. But thank you guys for tuning in to the channel, I suppose. I'm sorry I've been away. But hopefully with the patch will be back in force and you guys see more on this channel. But I think guys, whoever tuned in and clicked on this video when I've been gone for 2 months, I appreciate y'all, and I'll see you guys soon, hopefully. Hey guys, see you guys later.